What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 173. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today I'm joined by my antiwar.com colleague, Dave DeCamp. He's the news editor there and has tons of great articles every day. Everybody really needs to start their day at news.antiwar.com to keep up with everything. We break down things happening, nuclear proliferation, the Iran nuclear deal, U.S. tensions with China. Of course, Dave has the best insights on all of this and is constantly writing about it. And so this is a fantastic interview. I know all of you are going to love it. Just be sure to share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle. We also repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, where again, Dave is the news editor and I am the opinion editor. And then you can find the show on YouTube, Odysee, and Rumble. We post the show on all of our social media accounts, Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. Donate at Patreon and Subscribestar. And then you could get yourself some great CBD products and support the show by doing your CBD shopping with our sponsor, Pluma Verde. PlumaVerdeCBD.com is the URL. They've been with us for almost a year now. Carlos and Vanessa run an absolutely fantastic company. They post the lab test results for their products right there on their website. For me, their products have always worked as I expected them to. They work consistently. I really like their topicals, a little bit of their sports cream once a day. It takes away pain for a long time. It works quickly, and it smells fantastic. So get your CBD products at Pluma Verde. They got gummies, they got soft gels, they got ed straps, they got stuff for your dog, anything you want. Just be sure you use the promo code PEACE, PEACE. That saves you 75 or 25% when you spend $75 or more. All right, now let's get into the interview with Dave. Hey Dave, how's it going? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest.
I'm good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back on.
Always decide to have all my colleagues from antiwar.com. Of course, everybody should be going to antiwar.com every morning and reading the news section. It's really the first thing you should do in the morning if you want to keep up on foreign policy. It's mostly Dave, but it's also Jason Ditz. And, you two and Eric do a great job of putting that, Eric Garris do a great job putting that together every morning. So great work, Dave. And we're going to be talking about a lot of those stories on today's show, starting off with Iran stuff, where there's a couple ways to, I guess, look at this from my perspective, Dave. One is that there's no way they could really screw this up because it's such an obvious win to just get Iran back within the JCPOA, get them back to putting some kind of limits on their nuclear program, have the IAEA come in all the time to verify they're not working on nuclear weapons, and what a victory that would be. But at the same time, they seem completely unwilling to do that. And so I saw a couple of your write-ups, one from the Iranian side saying they're expecting talks to start, I think next month, but I think that was in September. So maybe in October we're looking at talks, but then you look at reports from the American side and they say, well, the Iran nuclear deal may not be so advantageous for us to do anymore. So what are your thoughts on all this, Dave?
Yeah, so Iran's new government under Ebrahim Raisi, he's the new president. He was sworn in at the end of August. And, they're saying that they're going to resume talks, but they're not really giving a specific date. They said earlier, it was in October. They said it could happen within 50 days or so. So that gives a bit of a timeline, maybe early November. And then on the U.S. side, the statements from officials like Blinken and stuff that they've been saying, time's running out. Iran, the window of opportunity is closing. So really what is happening here is, they engaged in talks from April to June with Hassan Rouhani's government, the last president. And the Biden administration, they refused to lift all Trump-era sanctions, which is what would have returned the U.S. to the deal and gotten Iran to go back into the limits, restrict its nuclear program to the really strict limits under the JCPOA. But because Biden refused to lift all those sanctions, it forced Iran to negotiate limited sanctions relief, which is a pretty big concession for Iran to make. the talks dragged out. The two sides couldn't come to an agreement. The Ayatollah Khamenei, he said that the Iranians, they wanted a written guarantee from the Americans that they wouldn't withdraw from the deal again, which I think is pretty reasonable. The Americans wanted to add a clause that said the Iran agrees to follow on negotiations on other issues like their missile program, but refused to put in writing any guarantees that they wouldn't withdraw from the deal again. So it wasn't good enough kind of for either side.
And there was also this like sanctions removal mechanism that Iran wanted to add to the deal, or at least I've read reports about that. Do you have like the details of what that is? Because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of U.S. sanctions on Iran, and there, at least the way I understand it, there are like different companies or sectors in Iran who are essentially sanctioned like 2 or 3 times. Like the construction sector was sanctioned, but then like the shipping company was also sanctioned. That was bringing in the construction materials, and then the actual owner of the construction company was sanctioned. And so, what does removing all Trump era sanctions even mean? Seems to be a fair question for Iran to ask, I think.
It does. Well, so that's Iran's demand, all Trump-era sanctions. And I believe the number is 800 individual sanctions in total that the Trump administration imposed on Iran. And the Biden administration broke this down into 3 categories: nuclear-related, terrorist-related, and human rights-related. So the terrorist sanctions, so-called terrorism, that's what the U.S. calls everybody they don't like a terrorist, are things like the designation of Iran's, the IRGC, their kind of elite military unit, as a terrorist organization, which the U.S. didn't want to lift that, but they would lift sanctions that on Iran's banking system that would get them back into the global financial markets and stuff, but they wouldn't lift these designations on the IRGC, which is pretty major because you think about how many Iranians were in the IRGC at one time. It sanctions all of them. Now, what actually they agreed behind closed doors exactly, we don't really know. But Rouhani and Zarif, the officials from the old government, they said that they reached a deal with the Americans that they would lift most major sanctions, and they probably would have kept in place some of the human rights ones and the what they call terrorism. So we don't really know. And what was acceptable to Rouhani probably won't be acceptable to Raisi. He's portrayed as a hardliner, which he is more hardline than Rouhani, but he's also very open to returning to the nuclear deal if the U.S. is serious about lifting sanctions. Now, that's the question. Is the Biden administration serious about it? Because it doesn't seem like it. All of Trump's sanctions are still in place. They've been implementing new ones. Now, these are minor. They've targeted people in Lebanon, people in Kuwait, people in China and Hong Kong that they accuse of financing the IRGC when they're probably just trading with Iran. And they're targeting Iran's oil trade to Asia. They haven't really gone after it yet. They've gone after some shipping companies that they say go there. But this is all happening as they're trying to get Iran to return to the talks. So they're just sending them really bad signals. And Raisi is not going to be as patient with the U.S. as Rouhani. And so the Biden administration, I think, has to show them that they're serious about this, which from, following it closely for the past 8-9 months, it doesn't seem like they're serious at all, especially their close coordination with Israel, who's constantly telling them to abandon the talks and take a more hawkish line with Iran.
Yeah. So one question I have, I guess, then, is if the Iranian government under the new administration of Raisi is going to be probably unwilling to compromise as much as Rouhani did, that's going to put the Biden administration in a tough position, right? Because then they're going to look like they're essentially caving to a more, this will be especially how Republicans describe this as like a quote unquote hard line Iranian government. And I feel like politically Biden has put himself in a real corner on the Iran issue. And so now, we have statements where it seems like the U.S. is not only saying like, hey, time is running out on the JCPOA, like maybe trying to get Iran to agree, but they're also saying things like we're going to look at options other than diplomacy. I think you have this one brand new out yesterday at antiwar.com. U.S. tells Israel it will turn to other options if diplomacy with Iran fails. And I had noted that one of the things that I saw within the Raisi administration is they say they're going to engage in talks with the U.S. so long as the U.S. isn't like threatening Iran, because they don't want to make it look like they're coming to the table at the whip of the U.S.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing. Making these threats. With Jake Sullivan, he met with the Israeli National Security Advisor yesterday in Washington, and the White House put out a statement that said Sullivan told the Israelis that the U.S. is ready to turn to other options if diplomacy with Iran fails. That's something Biden said a few weeks ago too, and Iran took it as a threat, which it sounds like a threat. And coordinating this closely with Israel, who constantly launches attacks inside Iran, I don't see what other way they're supposed to take this if not a threat, even if it's a threat of sanctions. They're waging an economic war against Iran. And the way, like you said, Raisi, he's not going to he's not going to want to appear to be coming to the table, making concessions for the U.S. like Rouhani did. And then politically for Biden, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal, you have all these Republicans, Democratic hawks, and the Israelis. No matter how he does it, say he returned to the deal, say he did it with Rouhani, barely even gave him sanctions relief. No matter how they do it, they're all going to go after Biden, calling him, they're going to make up some crap about him giving them money when it's releasing their frozen funds again. And so politically, whatever Biden does, he's going to get that criticism. So, but yeah, and after the whole Afghanistan thing, I don't see him standing up to all the criticism and to return to the Iran deal. But so I really don't know how this is going to shake out. On the other hand, Biden does want to shift away from the Middle East, and he wants allies like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE to handle certain things. So returning to the deal, it will de-escalate the region a lot, unless Israel decides to launch an attack on Iran like they've threatened if the deal is revived. So Israel's kind of the wild card here, but
yeah. So in your article, you mentioned, and this has been like kind of the phrase used by Israel and the U.S. for several months now, the idea of going to a plan B if diplomacy didn't work out, where, plan B sounds very vague and could be a lot of things. And I would assume that the Iranians would interpret that as some kind of threat, but now in your article you actually have a little bit more clarity on what plan B is, and that is economic sanctions. But at the same time, now Israel is talking about plan C, and that involves military action against Iran. And so I guess here's my question. It seemed like during the Biden administration, Israel has been willing to do essentially whatever it takes to keep Iran from being willing to engage in diplomacy with the U.S. Because, if their or if their nuclear scientists are being killed, if their ships are being attacked, they're not going to engage in talks from that position, right? And that kind of does, I think, make sense. So what do you think Israel is willing to do to keep the U.S. from getting back within this deal? Because it seems like a hell of a lot of dangerous action.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of talk, but they also do, attack Iran. I mean, when the talks started in April, they launched an attack on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility, caused an explosion. Like as soon as the talks in Vienna started, so it was just a clear effort to sabotage the diplomacy. And then the Biden administration backs these operations because they never condemn them. I mean, how they're letting Israel kind of walk all over their plans with Iran, their stated plans. It's tough to say that they weren't involved, that they might be involved in some of this planning. I mean, who knows? But and there was another attack in June at a Iranian warehouse, and this damaged. It was reportedly with a drone that damaged a centrifuge warehouse, and there was cameras there from the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, that were damaged in the attack. And now the IAEA, the U.S., Germany, France, they're all giving Iran all this crap about not having the cameras at the facility anymore, and none of them are saying anything about Israel, bombing the facility and destroying the cameras. Like, it's just such hypocrisy. And Iran, just how much longer are they gonna take this? It's just they're not giving them any incentive to return to talks. So
yeah. And then I noticed within the past 2 weeks, there was another drone strike in eastern Syria on a Shia militia. And, this is one thing that doesn't even involve Iran. Like, not directly, at least. Like, if Israel is gauging with Hamas in Gaza, if Israel or the U.S. is bombing Shia militias in Syria, and those militias are then attacking the U.S. In Iraq, those are all things that don't necessarily involve Iran and are certainly not things happening at the behest or the direction of Iran. But that is how it will be portrayed in the U.S. media, right? And so, we're dealing with a crazy another level on this, where essentially any violence in the Middle East is just pinned on Iran, and therefore you can't engage in the talks to save the Iran nuclear deal. This is something that came up in May when Israel was bombing Gaza and killing all the poor Palestinian children. Was, well, since Israel is massacring Palestinians, then terrorism, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and 1, 2, 3, skip a few, Dave, and suddenly, we can't negotiate with Iran because they're killing Israelis.
Yeah, a lot of Republicans were saying that at the time. They were saying Biden emboldened Hamas by entering talks with Iran, and they do the same thing with Yemen. They just blame that all on Iran, ignoring the Saudis' slaughter there. So yeah, I mean, the discourse is just so horrible that, like I said, no matter what Biden does, if he takes any step towards reviving the deal, they're going to go after him. So he might as well just do it,
Right. Well, that would certainly be my reaction if somebody, was like, oh, you can't do it, you can't do it, you can't do it. Well, it's going to happen. Now, I think you had one more on the IDF, and this is from the IDF chief saying that they're going to continue to launch attacks to destroy Iran's capabilities. Of course, this is this is something that always gets completely left out here, but they are targeting Iran's nuclear energy, right? So this would targeting this kind of stuff, maybe not the centrifuges or something like that, but some of this could turn power off to Iranians and actually make life in Iran a little bit harder and stuff like that, on top of just the insult of having a foreign power targeting your facilities within your country.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that is kind of definition of, you talk about terrorism, attacking civilian infrastructure. I remember in 2020, in the summer, there was kind of a string of explosions at Iranian power plants and industrial facilities. Now some of these kind of get amplified by the media because I think Israel wants to appear to be more powerful when it could just be an industrial accident that caused a fire or something. But some of those were, Israeli leaks to the media did claim some of them. It's tough to know how many, but and you got to think you're at the Natanz facility. There's explosions all the time caused by Israel. Explosive devices are planted in this facility, and it's a nuclear facility. Like, you think about how dangerous that is. So yeah, it's really reckless, and it's, in any other situation, this is an act of war, and Iran would have the right to respond if it was any other country attacking a U.S. ally like this, or us. I mean, imagine if somebody was doing this to the United States. It would wipe them out with bombs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it would be like the day when there were people calling for Afghan cities to be wiped off the face of the planet because ISIS-K killed some U.S. soldiers in Kabul. Yeah, certainly. If an Iranian, not even if an Iranian tied to the Iranian government with any proof at all, if an Iranian tried to in any way attack or destroy, harm, damage, sabotage any U.S. nuclear facility, that would be considered an act of war, and I would assume there would be airstrikes in Tehran in at least a couple weeks, if not within days, right? Even if, again, they have no proof of it whatsoever. And yet this is done routinely in Iran, publicly bragged about, and yet, there's no context given in any of the mainstream reporting in this at all, Dave. Oftentimes, or actually, as Daniel Larison has written very well recently on his Substack and at antiwar.com, Americans think Iran is the nuclear power, not nuclear powered as in, they use their nuclear energy program to power their homes, but nuclear power as in they have nuclear weapons capable of, destroying entire cities at a time. They think Iran has that, and it's actually Israel that has that capability.
Yeah. That's something I try to just throw into my articles sometimes. Just that, because a lot of the rhetoric too, they say if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, it'll start a regional arms race. But Israel already has nukes, a few hundred. So yeah, it's worth mentioning and reminding people. Same thing with a lot of these. I mean, sometimes it might seem redundant. I'm always covering these threats from Israel, but I think it's good to just stay on top of it and remind people that they attack Iran. They're constantly threatening Iran. They brag about it, and they're lying through their teeth about the whole nuclear. The idea that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they would be the first ones to have one in the Middle East. And through that, you can see how Israel lies about a lot of other things too, with the Palestinians and stuff. So I think it exposes a lot when people just understand that basic thing, that Israel has nukes, secret nukes, against every non-proliferation effort in the world, and the U.S. agrees to it and backs them and keeps quiet about it. Why? As they're bombing and terrorizing their neighbors in other countries. And so, yeah.
One of the other things to point out with that, too, is when they talk about that, they never really get into the details, because there are already U.S. nuclear weapons in Turkey, and I don't think, if Turkey is necessarily looking to nuclearize to combat Iran, but they're, kind of implicitly talking about Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Well, who the hell would sell them the nuclear weapons? Right? Like, we are already in talks under Trump. They were in talks to give Saudi Arabia essentially unlimited, unregulated nuclear technology. And so, the real, in between the lines there is it doesn't have to be that way, but it's certainly going to be exploited by the U.S. military industrial complex to make it that way should Iran get nukes, I think. And that is, I guess, something to be concerned about. Like, hey, if Iran does make nukes, we're going to have to work really hard to make sure that our government doesn't sell nukes to the Saudis and Emiratis, because I think that would be a very strong push from the Saudi royals, at least.
Yeah.
Anyways, since we're talking about nukes, and to move on a little bit, you have this great piece out today. And, Dave, there's so little coverage of nuclear warheads and how many nukes exist in the world and all this. So when Americans hear like, hey, China's going to build 300 new nuclear weapons, whether that's true or not, people get really concerned. China's doubling their number of nukes from 250 to 500. Oh my God, this sounds terrible. Well, you have a great piece here today that says the U.S. has, 33,750 active warheads and then another 2,000. So, it kind of seems like the China program isn't so intimidating then. Talk about a little bit about America's nuclear weapon numbers, though, Dave.
Yeah, the State Department, they just disclosed the numbers on Tuesday. 3,750 that are active. Some of those are deployed, and then another 2,000 that are retired, awaiting dismantlement. So that brings the total stockpile to about 5,750, which, like you said, is much bigger than estimates put China's stockpile around 300. And the China Hawks, they estimate that they're going to double it in the next 10 years. Some have said that they're going to triple, quadruple it. But even if, say they double it, they're still nowhere close to what the U.S. and Russia has. Russia has just over 6,300 about, including around 2,000 that are retired. But I count the retired ones because they're still nuclear warheads that can, wipe out probably a whole country. But yeah, and when it comes to China's proliferation, I mean, that's not good. Nuclear proliferation is bad, in my opinion, but the best way to control China's is for the U.S. and Russia to work together to dismantle their arsenals more and then enter negotiations with China in good faith and not just try to lump them in with Russia like the Trump administration tried doing when they were having nuclear talks as a way to, it was a clear way to sabotage the New START treaty, which Biden and Putin agreed to renew pretty much as soon as Biden came into office because it was about to expire. And that's the last nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia. So the U.S. has dismantled, and Russia, tens of thousands of nukes since the end of the Cold War. But right now we're kind of facing with this push towards so-called great power competition, the threat of proliferation is kind of back. And it's not just China, it's also the U.S. and its allies. The U.K. announced recently that they're increasing their nuclear stockpile. And nobody really had anything to say about that. I think their cap was about 180 warheads. They're raising it to 200 something. And you have this AUKUS deal with Australia and the UK that gives Australia nuclear technology. Now, nuclear submarine technology, nuclear powered, they would be conventionally armed is the idea, but they would be powered by nuclear power. And to be fair, this is different. Nuclear power, I think, is good, but to power these nuclear submarines, they have to use highly enriched uranium, which is the same thing that they use to make weapons. So the idea is you give Australia this technology, they could potentially make nuclear warheads with it. And, submarines are a weapon. So it is kind of a nuclear weapon. And there's kind of a gray area with the non-proliferation treaty. I mean, it doesn't ban nuclear powered subs, but it says the idea of non-proliferation is that the nuclear power should only be used for peaceful purposes, and submarines, to me, aren't a peaceful purpose.
Yeah. Well, it definitely seems like if this was Iran or North Korea or something like that, the U.S. would be absolutely throwing a fit and claiming that it was equivalent to building nuclear weapons and everything like that. So
that's true, yeah.
I mean, I think on that level, it's kind of easy to see that, at the very least, this is some pretty steep hypocrisy from the U.S. But on top of that, somebody had wrote a pretty good article explaining one of the big differences between the nuclear-powered submarines that Australia is now getting and the ones that they were planning to buy from the French that were going to be diesel-powered. And a big difference is how quiet the submarines are. And so the nuclear-powered submarines could operate far more into Chinese territory and have a lower risk of being detected. And so even if this isn't maybe a nuclear issue, Dave, where maybe the Australians never even bother, consider, have any idea in the world of turning these into nuclear weapons, they could load these submarines up with a hell of a lot of ammunition. Also, if the U.S. has nuclear weapons, I'm sure that China isn't like, well, the U.S. would never put a nuclear weapon on an Australian sub, and we're not even going, China has to consider all of this, even if the U.S. isn't doing it. But even North Korea was concerned about this, feeling like it was more offensive capabilities in the region, whereas diesel submarines would be a little bit more defensive in nature.
Yeah, and then from what I understand, don't quote me on this, but I've spoken with Jason about this. Jason Ditz, he knows a lot about nuclear power and stuff. And the nuclear submarines, they don't need to be refueled for like 30 years or so. So that's another thing. They can stay out there for longer. And there's a gray area too with the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, that when they established their inspection regime, there's a gray area with nuclear subs where they were supposed to inspect them when they refuel, but now they don't need to refuel, so they don't get inspected. So I wonder how that's going to shake out with Australia. They might not even get inspected by the IAEA. And like you said, imagine if Russia gave Iran or Syria nuclear-powered submarines, how the West would react.
Right. And, these are the kinds of things that we have seen be like the initial cracks in these nuclear treaties, these, arms control agreements. If you look at something like the INF treaty, right? It was like the U.S. putting the defense batteries, the Patriot missile batteries in Eastern Europe, because technically those can house missiles that the U.S. can put nuclear weapons on. And if you read the letter of the INF treaty, it says you can't do that. And also, I think Predator drones are something that are questionable under the INF treaty, since while it's not a cruise missile, it could act like one. Like, you know what I mean? You could strap a bomb underneath it and fly it wherever the hell you want. And so, as you develop these new technologies and send them off to new countries, that's going to create a reaction from other states. And so then Russia designs a missile that challenges the INF treaty, and now we no longer have this agreement. And it's, kind of hard to say that, maybe there wouldn't have been more room to negotiate on that if the U.S. hadn't fractured it in all these ways beforehand. And you really hope that this isn't one of those cases with the NPT, but it certainly could be the first step if China and Russia start to look to react to this agreement.
Yeah. I think the threat of an arms race, there is an arms race happening, with hypersonic missiles and stuff, but with this submarine deal, it's really just going to make the whole situation there more dangerous. And you see the UK, they deployed their new aircraft carrier to the Asia Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific as the US calls it. And they recently sailed a warship through the Taiwan Strait, something they've done it before, but I think this was the first time they publicized it. It's these are significant things, even though they're just symbolic. But in Australia and Japan, I've been talking about this for a while on your show now, but you see it all just the increased cooperation between the U.S. and its allies in that region, moving towards China. Everything's been moving that direction, and you see it with this AUKUS thing and the Quad meetings and stuff.
So with the UK sailing the warship through the Taiwan Strait, I noticed in the reporting of that there was some Chinese, harassment, maybe a generous word, but China didn't just let the ship sail through. Apparently they followed it, and then after the ship got out of the Taiwan Strait, they sent like a ship in front of it or something that caused it to not like change course, and maybe even the ships saw each other, but eventually would have to change course because of that. And so I was just wondering if you maybe expect more of this from China coming forward. It's certainly one of the things that I've been worried about, that eventually China is going to decide that, hey, the Taiwan Strait can't constantly have a presence of U.S. allied warships in it, and they're going to do something. Now, maybe you could get into how they've been flying through Taiwan's air defense identification zone, because I do think that's probably a response to it too. But I'm just wondering if they're maybe going to get, because we've seen this like with Russia and the Black Sea, or China and the South China Sea, where eventually, they start to maneuver their ships in ways to at least send a signal that, hey, that this isn't something we agree with.
Yeah, and this is something that I'm not really sure about the Taiwan Strait, but I know when the U.S. does their phone apps, freedom of navigation operations, they call them, near Chinese claimed islands in the South China Sea, the Chinese military usually says that they escorted the ship out of the area, or they chased them out, and then the U.S. military says, "No, we left on our own," because it's very childish, kind of the back and forth that they have. But um, with the Taiwan, with the British ship, I'm not sure the specifics. I know that they probably followed it out, but yeah. So you mentioned the air defense identification zone, and kind of there has been an increase in Chinese military activity, kind of near Taiwan, and this has really been grabbing some headlines in our media and the Western media. Um, so I've explained it on here before. I'll just do it quick. The air defense identification zone. Um, it's an area where a country wants foreign military aircraft to identify themselves, and they're not covered by any international treaty or under international law. It's something the United States set up in Asia in the 50s for Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and China made its own in the East China Sea a few years ago during the Obama administration. The U.S. responded by sending some bombers into it. Um, but you see these headlines that these Chinese warplanes are violating Taiwan's airspace, biggest incursion ever into Taiwan's defense zone. But it's not. These flights are not what the West is portraying them as. If you look at a map, or if you look at the ADIZs, Taiwan claims one over mainland China. Now, they don't report the ones over mainland China because then that would be insane, and I think they recognize that. But the ones that they started reporting these back in September 2020. So that's another thing. They say this is the most that have ever flown through this area, but we don't really know that because if you look at the map, a plane taking off from mainland China, they're pretty much they can be immediately in this ADIZ, even over the median line that separates the Taiwan Strait. So, and it's not, there were some outlets that falsely said these Chinese warplanes were in Taiwan's airspace, but airspace is over the physical territory of a country, and it extends 12 nautical miles outside off its coast. Judging from the maps that Taiwan's defense ministry has released, these planes were nowhere near that, and they never are. They're usually in the southwest corner. They've flown some in the south, if people are looking at the map of it right now. Sometimes in the southeast, in the Bashi Channel, if that's how you say it. But it's never close to the island. But this is enough for the Western media and Taiwan to really portray it as China getting really aggressive against Taiwan. And now China knows that they're going to get this reaction when they do this. They know that they are sending a message. It's not nothing. I don't want to make it seem like it's nothing, but if you've been following this, these really started Taiwan. They first started publicizing these flights in September 2020. And what happened in September 2020? Well, in August 2020, the U.S. sent Health Secretary Alex Azar, he was Trump's health secretary, to Taiwan, highest level U.S. official to visit the island since 1979. And then they sent another, it was like a deputy economics, I forget exactly what his title, in September. And that's when there was this big Chinese incursion, they called it, and Taiwan started releasing this stuff. So these steps for the U.S. to increase diplomatic ties with Taiwan arguably are more provocative in China's eyes than the military activity, because that is a signal that the U.S. wants to change the status quo, the one China policy, and that their interest is in good cross-strait relations. But
real quick, so I haven't heard anybody make that point before, and I think it's really, really important that for China, the diplomatic ties are more provocative than, say, sailing the warships through the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. Do you think there's like a recognition of that within like especially now the Biden White House, because it seems to me that that they really only play up the military angle, and my guess is that they see that as the most important thing.
You think the Biden administration, that they play up the military more?
Yeah, generally
I
speaking.
think,
I just feel like whenever there's like a ship going through the Taiwan Strait, I heard more about that than, say, Tammy Duckworth flying to Taiwan to bring vaccines and stuff like that.
yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, they recognize it, that it is, if they change this policy, this one China policy, that would be, a major step. And even the most hawkish people in the Biden administration have said, we're not changing that. Some senators like Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley, like real China hawks, want them to, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen soon. But these steps are significant. And I put a quote in one of the articles I wrote about this from a guy named Raymond Green, and he's the deputy director of the American Institute in Taiwan, which is the de facto U.S. embassy. And he said a few months ago, he gave some speech at some event, and he said, he explained how the U.S. views Taiwan differently now. He said when he first came to the Institute, that everything was focused on cross-strait relations, making sure tensions between Taiwan and China were not too high. And he said now the U.S. no longer sees Taiwan as a problem in our relations with China. We see it as an opportunity to advance our shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. And so that kind of outlines it right there, how the U.S. now views Taiwan as an opportunity to counter China. And it's not just this kind of weird situation that it was, that they this weird status quo where, they've always sold Taiwan weapons since they stopped recognizing Taiwan in 1979. But we're interested in low tensions between Taiwan and mainland China. But now they're using Taiwan, and it's only going to lead to more Chinese flights, because China's not going to take this, they're not just going to sit back and let this stuff happen. And that's when you usually see their flights in the ADIZ, is when a U.S. official goes there or something like that happens, or Taiwan says something. It's a lot of the symbolic stuff.
Just real quick, for people who are only listening, I do have the map up here of where these flights are taking place. And, assuming, let's say that, Taiwan is Cuba here, this would, Cuba claiming that the U.S. has to announce all flights going into Haiti or something like that. This is a significant distance from the Taiwan island that these flights are taking place. And so just to make sure people understand that this isn't even people on the Taiwanese island can't look at in binoculars and be like, oh, there are the Chinese planes flying off the coast or something like that. This is a significant distance into I guess was at the South China Sea on that side of Taiwan. Now, one thing I noticed you had written up here, and I think this ties to all the stuff we've been talking about so far, and that is Taiwan as foreign minister wants Australia's help to prepare for war with China. And you have to wonder, right after the AUKUS treaty gets announced, maybe this is something that the U.S. had not so secretly put in there with Australia, that hey, we're going to sell you this, but we're expecting more help for Taiwan too.
Yeah. Well, that's what they want. They want Australia to take a bigger role in the region. They don't want to do it alone, the U.S. They want Australia and Japan and India now too, and France, even though they pissed off France with this deal. But France seems to still be going along with this stuff against China. They want their allies to increase ties with Taiwan and to send their warships near China to try to intimidate China. So yeah, this is definitely part of it. And there might be some greater plans for Taiwan in the works, more behind the scenes, that they're afraid to kind of speak about publicly. And I mean, Australia, it's really how they have just bought into all this and are following the U.S. when their relationship with China over the past few decades, a trade relationship, and just throwing everything away to follow the U.S. And so they're going to play a big role in all this, and the U.S. is going to send under this deal, which I'm sure you talked about. They're going to send more missiles and troops and aircraft and all sorts of stuff to Australia as part of this deal. So they'll help them with their Asia pivot.
Yep. So let's see, what else do we have here on China, Dave? There were some recent thoughts. Oh, no, let's do Senkakus first. I know we've already covered this, but just because the Biden administration said it again, I think it's worth mentioning. You got this little island that to me seems like it is probably actually should belong to Taiwan, if anyone, because it's the closest major power to it. But this island that's 400 kilometers away from the, I guess, closest claimed Japanese island is, off the northern tip, maybe north, what would that be? Eastern tip of Taiwan, about 200 kilometers there into the East China Sea. And it's claimed by China, Taiwan, and Japan. But the U.S., since the Obama administration, has insisted that it will defend China's claim to this island. So what the hell is the reason for this?
It's a good question. So the Senkaku Islands, like you said, they're in the East China Sea. They're uninhabited. They're controlled by Japan, and they're claimed by China and Taiwan. And there's been some incidents with Chinese Coast Guard ships near the islands, and that upsets Japan. And the U.S. Has decided that the mutual defense treaty between the U.S. and Japan covers these islands. So it's another tripwire. It's another potential flashpoint for a war between the U.S. and China, these islands in the East China Sea. And, they were controlled by the U.S. after World War II, and I believe it was the 1970s that Japan took over the administration of them. So I don't know too much about them. I don't know what the big significance is. It's probably oil resources or something, or just they view it as a strategic spot. I guess it's part of the first island chain, which is what they call an area that goes from the Philippines up, to northern Japan. And the U.S. wants to place missiles along this first island chain. So who knows? Maybe that's part of it, that the U.S. wants to put some kind of base there or a lily pad or something. But they probably view it as another way to kind of counter China and don't take into account how, kind of irrational it is to say that you're willing to defend these rocks from China. It's just really, it's just another tripwire.
Yeah. Daniel L. Davis has a great article out today where he, talks about this. Like if the U.S. were to fight China for Taiwan, or I guess the Senkakus as well, it's not like the U.S. could win that war, right? Like even on the best case scenario where we go in a conventional conflict and end up driving the Chinese out, then we have to constantly militarily occupy it forever, because that's going to be the only thing repelling another Chinese invasion. And that'll certainly become the consensus in the U.S. mainstream. And that's the best case scenario, is that we get ourselves in an unending occupation where our troops are constantly at risk, a couple, 100 miles, maybe 100 miles off of China's coast. And obviously I think most likely scenario would be that China, after killing 2,000 to 10,000 Americans, ends up essentially winning the war, and the U.S. has to bat down, because it's either that or go nuclear. And hopefully our president decides that that's not the right thing to do, just because China has developed this what is called area access, area denial, or something like that, where essentially they just develop weapons to make sure that the U.S. can't get within 500 or so miles of their shores in a conflict, and they'll be able to destroy our planes and ships and stuff like that and cause a massive amount of casualties to our conventional weapons capabilities.
Yeah. And I mean, if you think about, I mean, the U.S. it doesn't occupy Taiwan, but the U.S. has supported the militarization of Taiwan since they stopped the Chinese from invading it in the 50s, since they stopped the Mao and the communists from, attacking Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang Party after they fled to Taiwan. So this whole thing is a result of the U.S. intervening in the Chinese Civil War, which it's kind of amazing how many people don't understand that the U.S. doesn't recognize Taiwan as a country. Not even just typical, who you would kind of typically think just wasn't aware of it. People that our friends that are good on this stuff. A lot of people didn't realize that. And the World Health Organization thing where the guy hung up when he was asked about Taiwan, that made me realize that a lot of people don't understand the history of it and why the situation is what it is. And I gotta learn. I want to learn more about kind of internal politics in Taiwan, because Taiwan and China is Taiwan's biggest trading partner. If you look at the travel statistics, I mean, millions of people travel back and forth. They have families in China and Taiwan. And I know that there is a reunification politician who's kind of popular. He's I guess reunification isn't exactly the right word, because the Chinese government now never really had control of Taiwan, but unification. And the idea that if Taiwan and China negotiated a one country, two systems thing like they did in Hong Kong, it's much different than Hong Kong because it's an isolated island and they have a military, and they wouldn't, it's not like China would just take them over right after that. It's just a different situation.
Right. I mean, I guess it would depend too, right? Like Hong Kong is in just a less strategic position, but also they have so many internal problems that I think kind of fuels the China issue with like the corruption within the real estate market and stuff like this. Like a lot of the protests that had gone on in Hong Kong, I mean, some of them were directed in China, but some of them were, directed at like just the young people being upset with their living conditions and prospect in life. The number of like 20-year-olds who live with their parents there, not out of necessarily being in like student debt like Americans, but just not being able to afford any small apartment, creates a lot of the discontent. So if Taiwan mismanages itself so poorly over 20 years that the people are like, well, China looks like a better option, I'm sure that would create that situation too. But it would be entirely different, I think, for a similar policy for Taiwan than that happened for Hong Kong. Dave, we've got just a couple minutes left. Can you find any like bright spot on the American-China relationship horizon? I saw that there were some talks going on, but then I saw Biden's trade representative was like, well, China's awful, and so we're going to maintain essentially the Trump policy anyways.
Yeah, his trade representative basically said that the other day. I think she's meeting with Chinese trade officials this week. Jake Sullivan just met with some Chinese officials. I haven't really read up on it yet. So I don't really see a bright spot when it comes to China, unfortunately.
All right. Well, thanks for leaving us on a bright spot there, Dave. But everybody, be sure to read Dave every day. I know it's like not it's not going to cheer you up to, read him in the morning, but will like set you in a proper state of mind to hate the state and want to try to bring down the U.S. empire and fight against it all day long. Dave, thanks for all you do at antiwar.com. Of course, news.antiwar.com, at DeCamp Dave on Twitter. You're pretty active there. You put out some pretty spicy tweets. And just Awesome, and everybody, coming off of the Horton Crystal debate, I feel a little bit more energy, and
Yeah.
just realizing how empty our opponents and all of this are. That these people maybe don't realize the what they're doing in China and in the East China Sea with the Senkakus and Taiwan, and what kind of position they're putting the U.S. in, how many Americans they're going to get killed, and I just see it as increasing their pocketbooks and getting to play world dictator is probably a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. People don't understand the implications of what the U.S. is doing over there. A lot of the big reason why is because people don't know. So, but if people want to follow it, they can read antiwar.com. You just got to skim the headlines. You can read the first paragraph of an article or two. That's all you need to do.
I mean,
You don't
most
need
of
to
your
read it.
articles, Dave, are only 8 paragraphs. Everybody could get through it. Like, take the time,
Yeah,
read the whole thing. You put in, like, especially if you're new to it. I mean, you put in a little bit of work to read the thing, because you do throw in details like, hey, Israel has the nuclear weapons program, or look at all the, like, activity that the U.S. has going on with spy planes around Russia and China and all this important context that you don't get when you just read the headlines and first paragraph at Reuters, which I think is what a lot of people do. But Dave, thanks for coming on the show again. I'll have to have you back on soon.
yeah. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for having me.